Happy Halloween, Modonauts! This is Ed Ferrari from Foundry, and I thought I would do a video demonstrating how to make a jack-o'-lantern or a pumpkin with Mesh Fusion in Modo. This is 100% Mesh Fusion. We go over a lot of other topics, but this is purely a modeling and Mesh Fusion type of video. There are much easier ways to make a pumpkin. There are easier ways to make a jack-o'-lantern, but I just use this as an excuse to use Fusion some more, which I'm always looking for. So I hope you enjoy it, and let's get started. The first thing we'll do is create one of the ribs, for lack of a better word, of the pumpkin. So I'm going to use a unit cube, so I'll hold Control and click on the cube icon in the basic toolbox. And this creates a 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter cube. I'm just going to go into polygons mode by pressing 3, and then I'll press R for scale. And I'm just going to scale this in the Y a little bit. And I'll press 2 for edges mode. I'll select this edge, Alt-C to loop slice. And right now the loop slice is set to free mode. I'm going to change that to uniform. And then I'll press W for move, and this center edge loop is selected. I'll just move this in Z positive, just so it bends a little bit like that. And then I'm going to press R for scale, and I'll just scale this in the XZ plane. And then I'll press Shift Tab to go into Catmull Clark sub D mode, 3 for polygons mode. I'll click in the viewport to deselect the polygons, W for the move tool, and I'll just move this in Z positive some more. And then 3 for polygons mode, I'll select the top and bottom polygons, Alt X to change the action center to local mode, and then E for rotate, and then I'll just rotate this. That's not giving me quite what I want, so let me undo that. Alt X to get rid of local action center, and let's turn symmetry mode on. So I'll put symmetry mode in the Y axis. So I need my symmetry options. So I'll hold Alt and click on symmetry. That brings up our symmetry popover. I'll just make sure this is set to Y. And then I'll just rotate this a little bit like so. I'll just move this. And rotate that a little bit more. E for rotate. That looks pretty good. 2 for edges mode. I still have this edge loop selected, so W for move, and I'll just move this. R for scale, and then I'll just scale this in the XZ plane. And then 2 for edges mode, I'll select these two edges, Alt-C. Now that is very angular, I don't want that. So W for the move tool, I'll just move this out a little bit. And then I'll use the push tool, so deform. I'll come over to push, and I'll just push this out. I'm just trying to get like a nice, kind of like a bean shape. Okay. And then I want the center to be a little bit wider, so 2 for edges mode. I'll select this middle loop. I'll just widen that a little bit. Open square bracket to select the inverse, and then I'm just going to scale that inwards a little bit. I want the middle to be the thickest part. Okay, so 2 for edges mode. I'll select this inner loop again, and I'll just scale this out a little bit more. And I think that's okay. W for move. Let's push that out a little bit more. Okay. Now I think I want to freeze this because right now it just doesn't have enough geometry. This would work, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to freeze it. So I'll turn off symmetry. I'll go back to X-axis just so next time I turn symmetry on, it'll be on the X, and then I'll just unpin this symmetry popover. I'll come over to geometry, freeze, and I want the freeze curves as faces, and everything else is fine. I'll click OK. And now this is standard polygons. So if I press Shift Tab, now we have this kind of shape. I'm just going to run a smooth operation, the standard smooth command. So Shift S, and the iterations at the moment is set to 1. I'm just going to do this very subtly. So left mouse button click, and I'll just drag to the right just to kind of smooth it out a little bit. And then 3 for polygons mode, W for move, and then I'm just going to move this a little bit into Z some more. And now we're going to procedurally radial array this, so we get a bunch of duplicates of the ribs. So I'll come over to the Mesh Ops tab right next to the item list, and while I'm here, I'll just rename this mesh item to be pumpkin underscore outer underscore rib. And then I'm going to add an operator, and I'll choose radial array. And straight away it's a little bit too much, so I have to expand the radial array sub-operations. So right here in the tool pipe, I'll click this little arrow or triangle, and I'll click the helix generator. And we have a count of 24. I'm going to change that to, let's try 8. Okay, that looks okay. It might be not as many as I would like. Let me go to 11. 11 looks pretty good. I might need to thin these down. Let me try 9. Just kind of seeing what might work. And then I can always return to the base mesh, and I can just move this out a little bit and see what it gives me. Now, the problem with doing this is we're getting a hole through the center. So if I turn off ghosted mode by clicking this icon right here, we can see we're getting a hole, which it's not the worst thing. I can always fill that. So let me just press R. And if I try to use one of the transform tools or any of the direct poly editing tools with ghosted mode turned off, I'm going to get this warning. So let me click OK. I'll turn ghosted mode back on, and then I'll press R. And I'll just scale this in a little bit, just to make the ribs a little bit thinner. A little bit thinner. W for the move tool, and I'll move that in. And let me turn ghosted mode off. And let me try increasing the helix generator back to 11. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with this. So Q to drop the tool, and I'll collapse the radial array, and I could just go with this. One thing that's going to become clear is if I freeze this mesh up and then unmerge all of these pieces and then try to mesh fusion these together, if I try to fuse all these different pieces. Let me go inside. We're going to notice this. Oh, it might be a little bit hard to see. We have kind of a void in here, which I'm kind of looking at right now. So we're going to have to fill that. So let me show you exactly what I mean by that. So I'll right click on the radial array. I'll choose freeze. That makes it not procedural. And then I'm going to come back over to the regular standard items list, and I'll right click on the pumpkin outer rib, and I'll choose unmerge mesh. That will create separate mesh items for each of these separate pieces. So if I were to try and fuse these together, that void would be very apparent. So let's actually create let's create a core that we can use to fill that void. So N for new mesh item. I'll just name this pumpkin. Oops. Underscore core. And I'll go to the basic side tab, control, and click on the cube to create a unit cube. So with my pumpkin core selected, I'll just click on this and Shift D, and I'll just use Catmull-Clark subdivision method, click OK. I'll do that again, Shift D, Catmull-Clark subd, and that gives us a nice spherical core. R for the scale tool, and I'll just scale this uniformly, just so it fills this space. And if it kind of pops through here, that's fine. That's actually not a bad thing. I will make it a little bit smaller though. So Shift Tab to go into Catmull-Clark mode, and I'll just scale it up a little bit. So on the top and bottom we have this little kind of flat area. And the top will be hidden by the stalk that we eventually make. Okay, so now let's fuse this together. So 5 for items mode. I'll select the pumpkin core and hold Control F to bring up my fusion pie menu, and I'll choose new fusion, and I'll call this fuse underscore pumpkin underscore main, because this is going to be our main part. Strip width, by default that's usually 1 millimeter, and that's what we'll leave it at. I'll click new fusion with selected meshes, and then it's a little bit difficult to see, but if I turn off some of these pumpkin outer ribs, we can see we have a fusion item here. So now the idea is I'm going to select these pieces, and I'll fuse them to the center primary fusion source. So I can just come over to the Fusion pie menu, or the Fusion side vertical tab, and I can click this first icon under Set or Change Mesh Role. And now these are all kind of contributing to the primary source, or to the primary sort of Boolean. And if I go inside, you can see we have no empty void. So if I hold Control F and toggle the source visibility, and then I kind of pass through the mesh, you can see there's no inner hole because it's being taken care of by that pumpkin core. So now we're going to work on hollowing this out. But actually, before we do that, let me just create some sort of mesh that we can use to punch a hole through this so that we can actually see and appreciate the hollow or cavity aspect of this pumpkin, because this is going to be more like a jack-o'-lantern. So we need a part that's going to punch through this. So I'll just make a temporary mesh. So N for new mesh item. I'll leave this here, but I'll name it temp hole underscore puncher, because that's what it's going to do. It's going to punch a hole through this. Come over to the basic tab, control, click on the cube, 3 for polygons mode. I'll just move this in the y-axis. 3 for polygons mode, select these 2 polygons, control X, and then control D to subdivide this. I'll use a subdivision method of Catmull-Clark. I'll select this edge and control X, select these 2 edge loops and radial align that. P for polygon mode, select these 2 polygons, or actually I pressed P to create a polygon in those empty spaces, but then I selected the polygons by pressing 3. B for bevel, I'll just bevel this inwards, and then C for the edge slice, I'll just slice this vertically, and then I'll have multi-slice on, and I'll hold shift and click here, and then just slice this so we have all quads. And then here I'll do a different method. This is no big deal, but I'll just delete this polygon. 2 for edges mode, I'll select these 2 edges, holding shift I'll select these 2 edges, and I'll come over to edge, bridge, and right click. And then 3 for polygons mode, R for scale, and I'll just scale this in the YX plane so we have a nice cylinder. 2 for edges mode, Alt C, and I'll bump up the count to 5. I'll enable the visibility of my fusion item. I'll select this edge, and then I'll go inside and select this edge. B for bevel, we'll just bevel that like so. Shift tab, now we have a nice cylinder. 5 for items mode, and I'm going to make all of my fusion sources visible again. And I'm just going to click on this cylinder, this temp hole puncher, drag it onto this rib, and from this menu I'll choose Fusion Apply Subtraction. And now we have a nice hole punched in, but it looks like, is it hitting the core? I'm not sure. Let me hold Control F and temporarily toggle my source visibility. It looks like it is hitting something, which might be the core. No, it's actually these 2. So I have to subtract the hole puncher from these 2 ribs. So let me make this visible again. Take my hole puncher, make that visible, and I'll just drag this onto this rib and choose trim. And then I'll click on the cylinder, drag it onto this rib, and choose trim. And now the hole puncher should go a little bit deeper, and now it's actually hitting the pumpkin core. So if I just select these 2 items, the cylinder, the hole puncher, and the pumpkin core in items mode, and then come over to my fusion side tab and choose trim, now the cylinder is going all the way into the pumpkin. So Control F, toggle source visibility, Control 1, choose the bottom option to toggle the grid work plane, and now we can see what the cylinder is actually doing. So now we can actually work on making this hollow. And then later on we can replace this this hole puncher, this cylinder, with an actual kind of like facial features, like eyes and a mouth, maybe a nose for the pumpkin. So I took a minute and I just renamed some of these fusion source items because when I unmerged the mesh, they kind of carried over that original pumpkin rib name, so I just gave them a name and just organized them numerically. So the next step is to work on the inner ribs, which are going to create a whole new fusion item, which is going to be used as a compound trim to hollow out the inside of the pumpkin. So I'm just going to select all of these fusion source items as well as the fusion item, and I'll press Ctrl G to group this, and I'll just call this GRP for group underscore pumpkin underscore outer. And then I'm going to press N for a new mesh item, and I'm going to call this pumpkin underscore inner rib underscore 001. And this is going to be a merge mesh operation. I'll make two of these and I'll record it, and then I'll make the others kind of on my own. So I'll click mesh operations, so I get the mesh ops tab. I'll add an operator. I'll create a merge meshes mesh op, and then I'll click on the little arrow to expand the sources of the merge meshes mesh op. I'll add a source, and I'm going to choose pumpkin outer rib 001. And then I'm going to come back over to the item list in the top here and press N for new mesh item. I'm going to call this one pumpkin underscore inner underscore rib underscore 002, and again add operator, and I'll create a merge meshes mesh op, and again I'll expand the sources and I'll choose pumpkin outer rib 002. And I'm going to keep doing this. I'll do one more and then I'll do the others on my own. So N for new mesh item. I'll rename this pumpkin underscore inner underscore rib underscore 003, and add operator, and we'll do a merge meshes, and I'll create the source. It will be outer rib 003. So I'll be back and then we'll continue. Okay, so I just added the pumpkin inner core. The merge mesh source for that is the pumpkin main core. So as you can see, I'm using the outer ribs and the main core as the sources for this inner core. So right now, these are just a duplicate of what I already have as the outer core. So we have double geometry for each of these parts. Now the idea here is to take this duplicated geometry, which we created via the merge meshes mesh op, and we're going to push this inwards. So first, let me just, to stay organized, let me just grab all of these inner pieces and Control G to group them, and I'll rename this group locator GRP underscore pumpkin underscore inner, and then I'll expand that. And I'm actually going to come over to my schematic. If you don't have your schematic in your modeling layout, I'll just show you how to create that really quickly. So I'll just tear this off and close it. So if your viewport looks like this, you're in your 3D perspective viewport, you can come over to the top left corner here where you have this little orange dot, and you know you're hovering over the orange dot when you get this orange border around the entire viewport. I'll hold Control and left mouse button click and drag down. That splits the viewport into a top and bottom part, but it's a copy, so we have the 3D viewport in both the top and bottom. I'm going to change the bottom into my schematic, so I'll come over to the top right corner and I'll click on this little arrow, and I'll choose Utility, Schematic, and now I have the schematic in my bottom viewport. Now we're currently in the Fusion workspace, so I'm just going to click this arrow here to go into the overview. And before I do anything, because I'm going to create another workspace, let me just rename this Fusion workspace to fuse underscore, what did we call this? Pumpkin underscore main underscore workspace. It's a good idea to keep everything nice and organized. So then I'm going to create another workspace, and this is going to be more of a general workspace where I just do some temporary schematic work. So I'll click on this icon on the far left here, and that's add new workspace, and I'll give this a name. I'm just going to call this general underscore workspace. I'll click make active, and I'll click OK. Alright, so I'm going to come over to my pumpkin inner core, and above the merge meshes mesh app, I'm going to add an operator, and I'll type in push, and then I'll double click push influence. And then I'm going to drag this push influence into the schematic. If I double click the yellow diamond to see the geometry input, we can see here is our pumpkin inner core. I'm just going to select my pumpkin inner rib 001 through 011, and I will pull these in as well. Okay, and then I'll just kind of organize these just to keep things a little bit tidy. And this could be a little bit tedious, but there we go. Okay, so I'm going to select all of these. So shift select all of these. I can also lasso select them. And then holding shift, I'm going to click on the little yellow diamond and drag that into the geometry input of the push influence. And then I'll select the push influence. And I want to make sure that this push influence for all of these meshes in the operator section, I want to make sure the push influence is above the merge mesh operation for all of these. So in the inner core, the push influence is above the merge meshes. In the inner rib 1, it's above. Let me just go through all of these and make sure the push influence is above. Because in Modo, in the deformer stack, which is basically what this mesh operation stack is, the order matters. So whatever's on the bottom will happen first, and then whatever's above that will happen second and third and fourth and fifth. So it's a bottom to top order of evaluation or order of operations. So okay, with this push influence selected, I'll just scale down the schematic. I'll click the distance channel, and I'm just clicking this little area right here where it says distance, and I'm in items mode, and I'll press C to bring up the channel hall. And then I'm just going to click on distance in the viewport and just scale that into, let's try 70 millimeters. Now, these pumpkin inner pieces are now negative 70 millimeters smaller than the outer counterpart, which is in this group locator. So when I go to create a new fusion, we're essentially going to have a slightly smaller pumpkin. So I'll start fusing these pieces. So I'll select this inner core and Control F to bring up my fusion pie menu. I'll choose new fusion. I'll just call this fuse pumpkin underscore inner, and everything else is fine at the default. I'll click new fusion with selected meshes, and now I'm going to start selecting these pieces, and I'll do it half at a time. So I'll select these items, and then I'll shift select the inner core, and I'll click on this first icon underneath set or change mesh role, which is set mesh role to primary. And it appears to have failed, and we'll try and figure out why that has failed. It might be because these are fusing to the first fusion. So let me undo that. Now that we have two fusions, things could get a little bit more complicated. So let me actually do this by dragging. So I'll click and drag it onto the fusion, and I'll choose apply primary. Now that worked, and then I can just click and drag this onto here and apply primary. And I'll just keep doing this. Now, because I can't let things go, let me try one more time to select these two and then select this and choose primary. Okay, so for some reason it does not want to work, so we'll do this manually. So I just undid that, and I'll just click and drag it onto the existing primary and choose primary. Okay, so now that we have a smaller pumpkin, let's turn this group into a compound trim. So I'm just going to drag this pumpkin inner into the pumpkin inner folder, and I might get rid of this folder structure if it gets in my way. So I'll come over to the item list and I'm going to click on this one Fusion source item from the second Fusion setup. Let me just drag this to the bottom here. And it doesn't really matter which Fusion source I select, so I'll just select a random one. I'll select this one. And I'm going to come over here to Compound Trims in the Fusion side tab, and I'll click Convert Current Fusion Item to a Compound Trim. And by doing that, we now have a locator instead of a Fusion item, a second Fusion item. So I'm going to drag this locator above my first Fusion item, and that's just preference. That's so I know what's happening here. And I'm going to subtract this locator, which contains all of my inner parts. I'm going to subtract that from each of the Fusion sources of the original Fusion item. So I have to make these visible, and then I'm going to select this locator. I'll shift select this rib, and I'll choose Set Mesh Roll and Apply. I'll choose the first icon, which is Subtract. And here, if I look inside, you can see there is some trimming happening. Let me just make my hole puncher invisible. So it's a little bit difficult to see, but there is some trimming happening inside. It is becoming hollow. So I have to go around and do this for the rest of the outer ribs. So I'll select the locator, I'll shift select this rib, and I'll choose Trim. And we can see it's becoming a little bit more hollow there. I'll just go around, we'll just go counterclockwise. So I'll choose the locator, and let me actually try to select multiple ribs at a time and choose Trim. Okay, so it appears to have broken, but let's just keep going and see what happens. So I'll click on the locator, I'll choose these three primaries and choose Trim. I'll click this locator and choose these three primaries and choose Trim. I'll click on the locator and click this primary and choose Trim. And then finally, I'll click on the locator and I'll control click on the main core, which is the inner part here, and I'll choose Trim. And now everything has come back, and if I hold Control F to bring up my Fusion Pie menu and choose Toggle Source Visibility, so we don't see any of the sources, it looks like we have a nice pumpkin on the outside, and then if I go through the hole and look on the inside, we have a nice hollow interior. So for a second there, it didn't look like it was going to work, but miraculously at the end it did work. So before we move on to the stalk, let's move on to creating some facial features for our jack-o'-lantern. So I'm going to use a pretty cool little thing that ships with Modo, which is called the B-spline scene, or the B-spline template scene. So I'm going to show you how to install that next. So let's download the B-spline template scene. Now the B-spline template scene is part of the pFusion toolkit, which we can download from the Foundry website. So I'm going to pull in my browser, and I already have foundry.com loaded up. I'm just going to click on this little person icon in the top right corner, and then I'll click on My Account. And as that loads, we'll watch a little bit of Star Wars. Okay, so I'm going to click on the Products section next to Details and above Account Info. So I clicked on Products, and then we're going to search for pFusion Toolkit. So I'll just hold Control F and type in pFusion. Here it is, pFusion Kit Beta. And I'll click on Show All Downloads. And then we just want to download the update for Modo 11 compatibility. So I'm not going to click on it because I already have it. But once we have that, we'll just go into our Downloads section. So here I am in my download section. I have the pFusion kit. This is an LPK. So we're just going to click on this and drop it into our 3D viewport. And I'm not going to do this because mine is already installed. But after dropping it into the viewport, you can just restart Modo. And when you Uh, launch Modo again, you'll come over to Help, Kit Help, pFusion Toolkit Help and Files, and then click on Open pFusion Template Scenes folder. And here we'll double click on the B-spline template scene. And here is the B-spline template scene. So what is so special about this scene? Well, if you check out the item list, we have all of these different pre-made curves, and these are all B-spline curves. And then if I press 5 to go into items mode, and I click on this little box down here, we get the B-spline edit tools. So this B-spline edit form just gives us some really cool scripts that were written by Daryl, the co-creator of Mesh Fusion, for dealing with B-spline curves. So we'll use a little bit of this. We'll primarily use the prep and save preset. This allows us to save our final curve for use with the sweep assembly. And we'll use that in our pumpkin. So I'm just going to press N for new mesh item, Control Spacebar to bring up my Views pie menu, and I'll just go to a front view. And I'm going to come over to my basic side tab, and I'll left mouse button click on this icon, and I'll hold it until we get to the B-spline tool, so I'll choose that. And now I'm just going to start drawing out a sort of eye shape. So I'll left click in the viewport, and now we're just drawing a sort of eye shape with the B-spline curve tool. And this doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm just going to create sort of an angry looking eye just to give it some character. And I'll make it a little bit sharper at the corner here. And then I'll make a curve at the bottom so it has a little bit of a belly. Just a little round aspect to it. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because you can always add a lot. You can always just spend as much time on this as you want. And then to close a B-spline curve, I can either click on Close in the B-spline tool properties, or I can right-click on the first point, like so. And then now that it is actually closed, I can just continue to edit the points. And I'm still in add mode, so if I want to add points, I can still do that. So I'll just add a little bit more, just tweak a little bit more. And like I said, I don't want to get too, I don't want to be too precious with this. This isn't really a tutorial about, creating an eye shape. And anyway, this is a stylized, kind of cartoony looking eye. And I probably don't need this many points in this corner, but we'll just leave it. If you do want to delete a point, all you would do is middle mouse button click, but you have to be in add mode. So I did delete a point right there. And let's say that we are happy with this. So Q to drop the B-spline edit tool. I'll press 3 to go into polygons mode. I'll select this, and then I'll center selected all. And then I'm just going to press Control Spacebar to bring up my View pie menu. I'll choose Perspective, and I just want to make sure that this is centered on the on 0 in the Z axis. So if you're not sure, you can press 1 to go into Vertices mode. Select these verts, and then Geometry, Vertex, Set Position, click on the Z for the axis, a value of 0, click OK. Okay, Q to drop the tool, Escape to drop the selection. And now I'm just going to make my oct circle invisible by clicking the little eye. I'll give this eye mesh a name. I'll just call this pumpkin underscore eye underscore A. I'm going to make sure that I'm in items mode by pressing 5, and then with the pumpkin eye selected, I'll come down to the prep and save preset button and click on it. It will ask me where I want to save it. I'm going to come over to Documents, Luxology, Content, Assets. I'll keep it in Meshes. I have a folder here called Ed Meshes, which is where I keep all of my custom meshes. Ed Profiles, This could be your name underscore profiles. And then here I have a folder called ed underscore pumpkin profiles. And I'll just give this a name. It will be pumpkin underscore I underscore A underscore 001. And I'll click save. Now doing that, it will now create a nice 512 by 512 render with a nice render curve that's a little bit luminous. That's just for display purposes, and then I'll just close this. And now I can close the B-spline edit, the B-spline template scene, or I can keep creating B-spline templates. I might want to create a mouth next, or another eye. We can have multiple variations, but the point is that it might not work until I close and reopen Modo, but when I press F6 to go into the preset browser, I should be able to use the directory here on the left in tree view and just find my profile section, and there should be a pumpkin profiles folder, and here is my pumpkin eye preset. So I can use this in my actual pumpkin scene. Now if you don't see this folder, you might have to shut down Modo and restart it. It might need to just update, so make sure you save everything before you shut down. But the next time you reopen Modo, you should see your profile here. So now let's create a mouth for our pumpkin with the B-spline template scene. So I'll press N for new mesh item. That probably came all the way to the bottom of the item list. We'll just drag that to the top. I'll rename this pumpkin underscore mouth underscore A. And I'll make the eye invisible. I'm going to make the oct circle visible temporarily, just because this gives us a good idea of scale. I want to keep my mouth more or less in the middle of this circle. It might cross the boundary a little bit, that'll be fine. So control spacebar to go into a front view. I'm going to once again click on the B-spline tool, and now I'm just going to start creating a mouth shape. So again, I'm not going to be too precious with this. We'll just keep it pretty tight around the corner of the mouth. We'll do a kind of smile. And then I'm just going to make sure that I have the same amount of points on the right side as I do on the left side. So on the right side I have 2, 4, 6, 8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I'm not concerned at all with the left side symmetry. So I'll just right click on the first point just to get that to be closed, and then I'll start kind of adjusting this so it's a little bit more of a smile. So I'll just adjust these points. Again, if you really want to take your time with this, you know, I'd recommend doing that, but for this we're not going to worry too much about this. Okay, so I'll just make this a little bit wider. And we'll call that OK. Now to get symmetry, I'm just going to first make sure that these 2 points in the middle are perfectly lined up on the XY plane. So I want to see the vertices for this, so Control-1 to bring up my main pie menu, and I'll choose Toggle Verts. And now I'll make the oct circle invisible so that's not getting in the way. And with these 2 verts selected, I'm just going to come over to Geometry, Vertex, Set Position, and with the axis set to Y and the value set to 0, I'll just click OK. Alright, now I know that these 2 are perfectly aligned on the ZY plane. Before I said XY, but it's really the ZY plane. So I'll select this bottom vert and then shift up arrow to grow our selection all the way to the last vert before we hit the center vert. And then I'm just going to make sure in the symmetry section of our B-spline edit form, the axis is set to X, and I'm just going to select Grow Ordered Symmetry. And now we have a symmetrical smile. So everything on the left side is the same as it is on the right side. So now that it's symmetrical, I can actually add maybe a little tooth. So I'll give him a little fang. So 3, 4 polygons mode, I'll select the B-spline tool. I have to make sure I'm in add mode if I want to add points. So I change my mode to add, And now I'll just click here, I'll click one point right here, and now I'll start adding a tooth. But I can actually use some of these tools to do this. So I can select these 2 points, and then I can choose 3-point corner, and that just changes that each of those points into 3 points. So now again I can select the B-spline tool. Well, first I have to select the curve, so select the curve, and then with the B-spline tool selected, come over to add, and I can start adding. We can either give him a fang or maybe just maybe we'll just give him a square tooth because that will kind of fit nicer. So I'm just adding 3 points for every corner, and then I'm just adjusting this, and maybe we're happy with that. And I might actually bring this in so that the tooth is a little bit more narrow. That tooth was looking a little bit wide. Now I can go into vertex mode by pressing 1, select these vertices, W for move, and just move it in vertex mode. That's always an option. And I think we're going to call that done. If I want to add a tooth on the left side, I could just find out how many verts I have on the right side. So in vertex mode, I'm just going to select these verts. I have 19. And then on this side, I have 8. So I'm going to need actually 11 more. I'm sorry, what was it, 19? So yeah, I'm going to need 11 more points on this side in order to get the grow ordered symmetry to work. So I can do that really quickly by selecting this vert, making sure I'm in add mode with the B-spline tool selected, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So now I should have the same amount on this side, 19 vertices, as I do on this side. And again, I'm not even worried about the way this looks on the left side because I'm going to use the grow ordered symmetry tool to kind of even these out. So I'm going to select the bottom vert or the top vert. This time I'll choose the top vert. Shift up arrow to grow the selection until you really only need to get beyond where it's no longer symmetrical. So I can just come down to here. But just to be thorough, I'm going to go almost all the way to the end, but I'm not going to select this last vert. And then I'll click grow ordered symmetry. And now there is my my mouth, and it's nice and symmetrical. So 5 for items mode, I'll select my pumpkin mouth. Let me just go into perspective mode, or perspective view, so control spacebar, perspective. I'm just going to make sure that this is centered. So 3 for polygons mode, center selected, and then 1 for vertex mode. I'll select these verts, geometry, vertex, set position. I'll set that to Y, just to make sure they're all pushed to the Y axis. Now 5 for items mode, I'll select the pumpkin mouth underscore A, prep and save preset. It's already targeting my pumpkin profile section, so I'll just call this pumpkin mouth underscore A underscore 001, and I'll save that. And again, it will render it in a nice presentable 512 by 512 render. I'll close this. Let's try to press F6 for our preset browser, and here I have my pumpkin mouth. Alright, so here I am back in my pumpkin scene, and we're going to add an assembly. So I'll press F6 to open up my preset browser. Here are my profiles that we just made, but now I'm going to come up to Modo Assets, Assemblies, Modo Assets, Modo Assemblies, Item Assemblies, Mesh Fusion Assemblies. And here we have our profile sweep assembly. So I'll double click that and then press F6 to close the preset browser. And here is our profile sweep group. I'm just going to actually drag that above my compound trim. This is ultimately going to be a subtractive trim element. And I can also delete this pumpkin inner folder. We're no longer even using it. So I'll just close that. And let's see, I'm going to select this path here, this curve. I can either lasso select it in items mode, or I can open up the profile sweep folder and just make sure I have the path selected. And then in polygons mode, so I'll press 3 for polygons mode, E for rotate, holding control, I'll just rotate this 180 degrees, negative 180 degrees, and escape to drop the tool. Now this is going to be pretty cool. I'll press F6 to open up my preset browser. I'm still in the Mesh Fusion Assemblies section. I'm going to navigate back to my meshes. I have to find Ed's meshes, that's my folder. Here we are. And then I'll find Ed profiles and pumpkin profiles. I'm going to bring in my pumpkin mouth. Whoops. So I'll click on pumpkin mouth, and I'm not going to double click it because I don't want to just bring it into the item list, but I'm going to actually left mouse button click in items mode on this little widget right here. I don't want to click on the green triangle. I want to left mouse button click on the blue rectangle. So I'll click on that, and I'm going to import preset profile. And once I do that, you can see here is our mouth, and it's being swept along that path that we rotated 180 degrees. If it's a little bit hard to see, I'll temporarily disable the visibility of the fusion item. And I still have vertices showing, so let me hold Control 1 to bring up my main pie menu, and I'll choose Toggle Verts. So here you can see what's happening. So I'm going to once again click on this path, and 3 for polygons mode. I'll make the fusion item visible again. W for the move tool, and I'm just going to move this down beneath the circular cutout that we have from our hole puncher. I can press F6 to temporarily close my preset browser, Control 1 to bring up my main pie menu, and toggle the grid work plane just so we can see this a little bit better. And let's see, what do we want to do? So I don't want this assembly, this path assembly, to go all the way through the pumpkin. I just want it to go through half of it. So I'm just going to move this over a little bit, and I'm moving the actual sweep, the sweep path. So R for scale tool, and I'll just scale this, and W for move, and I'll just move it. And maybe I scaled it a little bit too much. I'll just scale that in the Z. And that is looking good to me. Now I can always press 5 to go into items mode. I can select the profile sweep profile, and then in polygons mode I can always press R and just scale this to make the smile a little bit larger. Sometimes it's a good idea to do this in local action center mode, so Alt X is the shortcut for that, and I can just scale that like so, just to make the smile a little bit wider. Another thing that we can do is I can come over to the profile sweep mesh, the actual procedural item, and in the mesh operations tab I can click on the curve extrude mesh op, and I can expand that and expand the tool pipe. And in the path segment generator, if I come over to the properties of our path segment generator, I can change the steps from 8 to 16. That will just give us more steps, which will help the fusion a little bit. So now we're going to subtract this from the pumpkin. So 5 for items mode. I just want to make my fusion source primaries visible. So let me come over to the item list just to continue doing that. There we go. And now I'm going to select the sweep for the mouth, and then left mouse button click and drag it onto the primary, and I'll choose Fusion Apply Subtraction. And there it goes. It's working a little bit. We have to do it again. So now we have this magenta wireframe for the subtraction, and I'll just do it to this part of the rib, Fusion Trim. And we'll have to do that to this one as well. So trim. So it looks like we actually have a Cyclops pumpkin. So Control F to bring up my Fusion pie menu, and I'll toggle the source of visibility. And then I will hide all of the contents of the profile sweep group folder, so we can get a good look at our pumpkin. So Control 1, and I can toggle wireframe by choosing the rightmost option. And there is our pumpkin. I'm going to actually take this temp hole puncher, and I'm going to remove it from the fusion. So before I do that, let me just make my wireframe visible again. So Control 1, and then the rightmost option, toggle wireframe. And then with the temp hole puncher selected, I'll come over to the Fusion side tab, and I'll click this icon right here, which will remove that from the Fusion. Now if I make it visible, it's just a cylinder again. So I'll just make that invisible here. And I think what I'll do is come over to the profile sweep group. I'll make that visible. I'm going to select the path, and then in polygons mode, I'll just move that up a little bit. Now we're getting a little tiny bit of lag, and if you want to kind of alleviate the lag, what you can do is come over to the Fusion item, and you can turn on deferred update. So with deferred update enabled, you can see that now I'm moving the path and I'm not getting any lag, but the fusion isn't happening until I release the left mouse button. But it's kind of like a perceived performance increase, and it's like a mode that I prefer to work in because it just feels a little bit more natural. Now I can still kind of grab this mouth shape and edit it. We can edit it in the B-spline mode, just in polygons mode, or I can just scale it. So I might actually scale it down a little bit because I don't really like how the teeth were kind of on that crease. So I might make it a little bit smaller, like that. I think I like that a little bit better, kind of a smaller mouth. I can try going the opposite. I can go a little bit bigger. That's pretty funny as well. But now the problem is I need to subtract the sweep from this rib and this rib, which I think I'll do because I like the way this looks. And I'll actually make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so 5, and I'll select these ribs. So I'll make the path visible. Where is that? It's right here. So I'll just select this, drag it onto this primary. I'll choose trim. See, and then I'll do the same thing for this side. Select the subtractive trim, drag it onto the primary, choose trim. Control F, I'll choose toggle source visibility, and I'll hide the folder. And yeah, I'm liking the way that looks. That's much better. It's a nice big smile. I might actually lower that a little bit though. So I'll select the path, 3 for polygons mode, W for move. I'll just move that down. And we can even kind of put that at an angle too by rotating the path just a little bit. There we go. Escape to drop the rotate tool. And now let's bring in another profile sweep for the eyes. So F6 for the preset browser. I'll come back over to the Modo assemblies, double-click item assemblies, double-click mesh fusion assemblies, and I'll double-click profile sweep. And then F6 to close the preset browser. And again, I'm going to find that profile sweep group 2. I'll drag that beneath profile sweep group 1. I'll expand that, and we'll find the path. 3 for polygons mode, I'll select this path, E for rotate, and I'll just rotate this negative 180 degrees like we did before. And this one I'll move up in Y, and we'll move it a little bit over in X. And maybe I'll actually rotate this as well. So Alt-X to go into local mode, which I prefer, W for move, and we'll just position this. And again, we'll press R to scale this in, move it out, because I do not want it to go through the entire pumpkin. Okay, and I think we're actually good for steps, but maybe just to be sure, I'll come over to the profile sweep, the procedural mesh, and come over to the mesh ops and expand the curve extrude until we see the path segment generator, and I'll increase the steps to 16. Okay, so now F6 to open up the preset browser. I'll navigate over to my meshes. I'll double click Ed's meshes, find my profiles, and I'll double click the pumpkin folder. Here we go. So I'm going to click on the pumpkin eye, not going to double click, just single click, and then 5 for items mode, and I'll left click on the blue rectangle, and I'll choose import preset profile. So there is our eye. It's looking okay. It's looking a little bit weird. I think what I'll do is come over to the item list, make my primaries visible again, and then I'll just left click on this and drag it onto our rib and choose apply subtraction. And I don't need the preset browser open anymore, so I can close that. And then I just need this to subtract from this rib as well. So fusion trim. There we go. And then click on the subtractive source and then drag it onto the primary. Whoops. And choose trim. And there we go. So if I, let's see, Control F to bring up the Fusion Pi menu, toggle source visibility. And there we are. At first I thought this wasn't going to work very well because the eye is a little bit too big and it's a little bit too low and close to the mouth, but I'm actually liking the way this looks. I think it's pretty funny. So I'm going to select the subtractive trim, the sweep, which is the procedural, and in the Mesh Ops tab, above the curve extrude, I'm going to add an operator, and I'm going to add a mirror operator. And that should mirror it, and it looks like it is, but I need to make it visible because it's not being trimmed from these two ribs right here, this rib and this rib. But I can see that it is trimming a little bit from this rib. So Control F to bring up the Fusion Pi menu, toggle source visibility, 5 for items mode, and I don't want to see the compound trim, so I'll make that invisible. And I just want to select this subtractive trim, drag it onto this primary, choose trim, and I'll have to do this to this rib as well. So Fusion trim, and let's see how this looks. Okay, Control F, toggle source visibility. I'll just hide these two folders. I'll Control 1 and choose toggle wireframe. And the eyes really are spread out too much, so we will change that. I mean, it does look pretty creepy. It looks kind of funny, but let's address that. So Control F, toggle source visibility. Control 1, toggle wireframe. I don't want to see the compound trim. I don't need to see these ribs, these primary ribs. I do want to see the sweep group, the second one. So I will select the path, 3 for polygons mode, W to move, Alt X to go into local mode. You can also do Alt S for selection, action center. And I'm just going to move this in a little bit. There we go, and I kind of like the way this is looking a little bit more. E for rotate, and I can just rotate this just a little bit. And actually, rotating the path will do nothing, so I shouldn't have done that. What I should do instead is rotate the actual eye profile. So 5 for items mode, I'll select the eye, 3 for polygons mode, E for rotate, Alt X, and I'll just rotate this into Z, just to give it a little bit of a tilt. So let's see how that looks. Control F to toggle the source visibility, and then I'll hide the folder. That's pretty funny. And you can tweak this until, you can tweak this forever. We could add a nose, but I think you get the idea. Control 1, toggle the wireframe. Let's have a look at this. So next we'll adjust the strips, and then we'll work on the stalk. Alright, so now let's talk about strips. I'll press Control 1 to bring up my main Pi menu, and I'll choose toggle wireframe to get that back. And I'm going to come over to my standard item list. I'll close up my profile sweep group, and then I'm going to click on my fusion item. Now you'll notice that the fusion item doesn't have any child items. Now the strips, which we can't have access to at the moment, they are going to be child items of the fusion item. So I'll select the fusion item. Now in order to have strips, I don't have to be in airtight final mode or airtight final with parts mode, but I'm going to do this because we're getting towards the end of this fusion. So I'm going to do that first, and then I'm going to press Control F to bring up my Fusion Pie menu, and the leftmost option is Create Update Strip Items. Now you can also come over to the Fusion side tab, and in the Fusion Strips section you can also click on Update Strip Items. It's just two different ways of doing it. I like the Control F Pie menu, so I'll just do that. And updating the strips can sometimes take a few seconds, especially when you have an object where there are a lot of strips, such as this model. But if I come over to the item list and check out the Fusion item, we now have child items. We have the strips folder, which we can expand, and it is a pretty deep hierarchy where each of these can be expanded even further. And these all represent the strip items. But we don't even have to worry about that because the strips are selectable in the 3D viewport, which is really nice. So we can just have a look at all of the areas where we have strips, and I can just start clicking on these. And when you click on a strip, you get this Fusion Strips pop over. So I'll just pin this and keep it in the top left corner there. So you can hold Shift and you can select multiple strips, and then in the properties section you can change the strip width and the strip profile. Let me just get out of here for a second, and let's try selecting all of the strips. So I'll click Select All Strips, and that selects all of the strips. And you can see everywhere that a Fusion source kind of interacts with another Fusion source, whether it's a primary or a subtractive trim or an intersect trim, we'll get a strip. So I'm just going to change all of these uniformly. We'll do 5 millimeters to begin with, and that looks pretty good. Maybe I'll try 12 millimeters, and that looks good as well. I can change the strip profile from 50% to 25%. Changing the strip profile will just change sort of how flat or how round or how sharp the strip is. So that looks okay. Now I might want to adjust some of these corners. You can adjust the corners individually, or you can adjust them all together. Just for time's sake, I'll adjust these all together. So a corner is where multiple strips meet. So here we have a three-part juncture. So this is a corner here, this is a corner here, and this is a corner. So if I come over to the strip corners in the Fusion Strips menu, and I choose any of these icons here, it will adjust the corner. So at the moment, we have this section here, adjust density to 20%. I always like to keep this a little bit low. I like to make small adjustments, so I'll put that down to 10. Sometimes I work at 5%, and then I'll click this. If I choose the rightmost option, this will become very round. So that's too round as far as I'm concerned. So Control Z to undo that. I can choose maybe this icon right here. That will round it out a little bit, but that's even too much. So let me actually try 5%, and I'll choose this second from the left, this kind of squarish option, and that kind of gives us a nice round kind of transition. So that's something that I can live with. So let me click off of the mesh to click away from the strips, and next we'll work on the stalk. So before I get started on the stalk, let's just tidy up our item list. I'm going to close this group locator, and I'm going to rename it. Earlier we had named it Group Pumpkin Outer. I'm just going to call it Group Pumpkin Main, because the stalk will be outside of this folder. I'm also going to take the two mesh items that are used for the profile, for the eyes and the mouth, and I'll just drag them above that folder but beneath the directional light. And then I'll press N for new mesh item, and this will be our the beginning part of our stalk. So we're going to use a B-spline curve to create the stalk. So I'll just call this CRV underscore stalk. And then if I could temporarily hide the Fusion item, but I think I'll leave it visible for now, just for a size reference. I'll come over to a front view, so Control Spacebar, front view. I want to see the grid, so Control 1. I'll choose Toggle Grid Work Plane, and then I'll click on my B-spline tool. I'm going to turn snapping on with options, so I'll hold Alt and click on snapping. I'll pin the snapping popover. I'll turn on grid, and I'm going to create a B-spline curve that's going to be it's going to have a point at every increment of this grid for 2 of these major grid units. So I'll click on snapping, and then I'll just start creating this curve. And I'm just making sure that it's snapping to each of the smaller grid increments. There we go. And 2 more. There it is. Okay. 3 for polygons mode. I'll select this in polygons mode. Or actually, let me select it in vertex mode. So 1 for vertex mode. I'll select all of the points. Control spacebar, and I'll choose perspective. Let me just make sure that these are all aligned along the appropriate axes. So geometry, vertex, set position, X, and then I'll do that again for Z. So geometry, vertex, set position, Z. Okay. 3 for polygons mode. I'll select this polygon, W for move, and I'll turn off snapping. I'll reset that to the vertex as a default, and then I'll close the snapping popover. And I'll just move this over a little bit. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to radial array this a few times. So I'll come over to the Mesh Operations tab. I'll add an operator, and I'll type in radial, and then I'll double click radial array. And then I'll expand the radial array mesh op, and I'll expand the tool pipe so we get to the helix generator. And 24 just seems a little bit too much, so I'll put that down to 10. That's not quite enough, so I'll do 12. And 12 seems pretty good. I'm okay with that. Okay, so now I'm going to make this taper, so I need a vortex effector. So above the radial array, I'll click add operator, and I'll type in vortex, and I'll double click vortex effector. Now I need to move this vortex effector to kind of resize it to the shape of the curves. So let me just temporarily toggle the visibility of our fusion item, and then come over to a front view, so control spacebar, front view. Let me just move this. Now, I don't want the vortex effector to start right beneath the curves. I actually want it to not affect the bottom of the curves if possible. So I'll start it right here. R for scale, I'll just shorten it a little bit, and then control spacebar perspective, and then I'll just scale it in the ZX plane to kind of get it to conform a little bit more to the curves. And a little bit more, I think. And that looks okay. Alright, so now I'm going to expand the vortex effector, or the general influence, so that we can actually get to the effector itself. And then in the properties, I'll click on taper per unit, and then in items mode, I'll press C for channel haul. And with the taper per unit channel selected, I'll just start tapering this by clicking on the taper and dragging. And maybe we'll do, let's try 26%. I don't want it to get too tight over here, but that looks okay. And then we'll do twist per unit, and with the channel haul still selected, we'll just start twisting this, and maybe we'll do 115. And we can always return and twist that a little bit more. Maybe I'll do 118, just bump that up a little bit. I'll just type in 118. Okay, so now we can add a bend effector on top of this vortex effector. So I'll add operator, choose bend, double click the bend, and then in items mode I'll just move this bend effector to where the vortex effector begins. You know, I could change the length a little bit just to make it a little bit longer. It's almost perfect where it is, but just to tweak it a little bit, we'll do that. Okay, and then I'll click on the angle, and we'll adjust the angle. And maybe that's okay. And then let's create another bend effector. So add operator, bend effector, and then I'll click on the actual effector itself, and we'll have to move this. So we'll move that to where the first bend effector kind of ends, like so. And if I just click on angle and try to change the angle, it's not going to give us the best results. So we also have to rotate this. So E for rotate. Let me actually rotate this maybe like so. I'll change the angle. Maybe we'll rotate that positively. No, that's looking terrible. So I might need to change how this is actually rotating. And this is a little bit tricky. So let me actually undo all of that, and let me try to readjust this. So I'll start it right here. I'll press E for rotate. We'll rotate it first. I'll rotate it 90 degrees, and then we'll work on the angle. And I'll press E for rotate. And that almost looks alright. I'm not mad at that. So angle, we'll do something like this. It's a little bit straight for my taste. I would like it to kind of maybe curve this way. Let me try rotating it. Yeah, see, I actually really like that. The only thing I don't like is how it's affecting the bottom curve here, the bottom of the curve. I kind of want those to remain radially aligned. So I could do something like this. Oh, it's also collapsing the inside, so let's not do that. Let me try increasing the length and see what happens. Yeah, that's okay. I actually like that. So I'll come over to the fall off, because I noticed that it is definitely affecting this area here. So I'm going to add a fall off, and I'll choose linear fall off, and I'm just going to position this. So E for rotate 90 degrees, R for scale. We can just scale this in. And you know what? I actually want this to I want this fall off to be used for all of these effectors, the bend effectors and the vortex effector. I think that might be nice. So I'm going to come over to my schematic, and I'll come over to the general workspace, and I'm just going to clear these from the workspace. So I'll click on one of the nodes, and just so you guys can see this, let me just right click and remove nodes. You don't want to delete, you just want to remove them. If you delete them, they'll be deleted from the actual scene. So let me select this fall off in items mode. I'll drag it into the schematic workspace. I'll click on this, double click on this yellow diamond. I'll choose this geometry. Here's the curve stalk. Double click the effector. Here's the bend effector. And I actually want to bring in the first bend effector. So bring that in. And this has an input for a fall off as well. And I'll just bring in this fall off. And I want the same thing to happen for the vortex effector. So I'll pull that in. And this has an input for a fall off also. So I'll drag that into the fall off. There we go. So I'm liking that a lot better. Let me just click on this fall off, and I can even move this up a little bit, like so. Okay. I wonder what would happen if I actually add a third bend effector. Let me try that. Let me just tidy this up. So I have this fall off, which is controlling all of the effectors. The first bend effector, the second bend effector, and the vortex effector. And all of these are being fed into the stalk, which is this curve, that initial curve that we radial arrayed. So if I want to add yet another bend effector, I'll just add an operator, bend, double click that. I'll just move that into place. Now this could be kind of a failed experiment, but we'll try it anyway. So I'll move this down here. I'll increase the length. So click on length, C for channel haul. Let's bring this up to the top, and then angle, and then I'll bend this, E for rotate, and then I'll just rotate this. And that actually, it's almost working. It's almost giving me the effect that I want. Let me decrease that angle. I'll move that up a little bit. And let me feed that fall off into this. So I'll pull this into the scene. So here's my third bend, or I'll feed this into the schematic, I should say. And I'll put this right here. This also has a fall off. This general influence has a fall off input, so I can put that in there. And I think I'll stick with that. I'm actually okay with that. So when I'm looking at this, again, I'm only looking at the curves. I'm not paying attention to the vortex effector and the bends. Alrighty, so I'll keep these here. Just temporarily focus on the viewport. Now we want to create a profile that will be swept along these curves. So in my item list, I'll press N for new mesh item. I'll name this Stalk _ geo _ profile. And then I'll hold Control and I'll click on the cube icon to create a unit cube. 3 for polygons mode. I'll select the top face of the box. Open square bracket to select the inverse. Control X to cut that away. Shift D to subdivide these polygons, or this one polygon. Subdivision method is Capmo Clark. 3 for polygons mode. Select all the polygons. B for bevel. Pull that in. I'll make that pretty small. 2 for edges mode. Double click this edge to select the loop. R for scale tool. Scale this in the X and Z. And then with this loop still selected, I'll come over to the deform tool and radial align that. Right click. And now it's a little bit more circular. 2 for edges mode. I'll double click these edges to select this. This is probably a waste of time, but I'll right click. I'll select the radial align. Right click in the viewport to get that nice and circular. Q to drop that tool. Shift tab to go into Capmo Clark sub D mode. And I'm going to kind of get this to position it right at the base of one of these curves. So 3 for polygons mode. Double click the circle. I'll come over to snapping with options, so I'll press Alt and click on snapping. Vertex mode is fine. Make sure snapping is enabled. W for move, and I'll just snap this to the bottom of one of these curves. And then I'm going to use a pretty cool feature that's fairly recent to Modo. It's the transform duplicate. So if I have the move tool enabled and I hold shift and control and then I translate it or transform it, you actually get a duplicate, which is really nice. So I can just keep doing that. And I could have, alternatively, I could have just radial arrayed this, but this is a little bit more interactive. It's a little bit more fun. So I'm just trying to duplicate this, and I want each of these circular pieces of geometry to overlap a little bit. There we go. And so far I'm pretty happy with this. Alright, it's not too bad. So what I ultimately want to do is, I'm going to need another curve actually that's going to be straight up and down. And then I'm going to need another profile in the center to create the core of this stalk. So let me do that really quickly. I'll come over to, I'll turn off snapping, and I'll close the popover. I'll come over to the curve stalk base mesh, and let me just press 3 for polygons mode. I'll select this, Control C to copy, N for a new mesh item, Control V to paste, and I'll call this CRV _ stalk _ curve. I'm sorry, _ core. And I'm going to center this on the X and Z, or Z. So basic, center selected, Z or Z and X. There we go. Okay, and then I need one of these circles, these circular geometries, to kind of adhere to the center of that. So I'll turn on snapping again. W for the move tool, shift and control, and I'll just snap that to that new curve. and then R for the scale tool, and I'll just scale this out so it covers, so it overlaps the outer circles. And then I might even just add some geometry just to give it a little bit more density. So Alt-C, we want a count of 1 for that loop slice. There we go. Let me just press Shift-Tab and see what that looks like. That inner one might be a little bit too small, so I'll just make that a little bit bigger. Shift-Tab, so it's all Catmull Clark. And let me select these polygons. Let me drag this to the bottom because we're actually going to unmerge this, and it's going to create quite a bit of, it's going to create a few different items. So unmerge mesh. So now we have, it looks like 12 including the original. Let me just also come over to our stalk. What happened to our curves? Why are they not showing up? So curve stalk. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I was still in the base mesh. That's fine. And then we still have this central curve. Where's that? Curve stalk core. That's right in the center. I actually want to drag that into here, and I want that to share all of the same bends and the fall-offs. So I'll drag that into the schematic, and I'm going to actually put that into here as well. So it will start to bend along with the radial arrayed curves. So here we go. And now it is curving as well. So now I'm going to freeze these curves so that we no longer need the vortex effector or the bend effectors or the fall off. So first I'll select the curves for the stalk, and I'll just come over to geometry. First I'll turn off snapping. It's not really necessary, but I just don't want it to get in the way. So I'll come over to geometry, freeze, and I just want freeze deformation on. I don't want freeze displacement or freeze curves, just freeze deformation. So I'll click OK. And then I'll come over to the center or core curve, and I'll do the same thing. I'll come over to geometry, freeze, and with just freeze deformation enabled, I'll click OK. So now I can select the vortex effector, the multiple bend effectors, and the fall off. And I can just right click in the item list and delete these. And I'll click yes and yes to all. Okay, so now in the schematic, I can still see these general influences. I can just highlight those, and I will delete them as well. So right click and delete. And yes, there we are. And I can temporarily remove these nodes as well. So I'll select them, right click, and remove. And I don't want to delete those, I just want to remove them. So now I'm going to unmerge these curves. But before I do, let me just go into polygons mode. And these are all kind of facing kind of the wrong direction. This might not be that important, but I think it might be a good idea just to take care of. Wherever you see these circles, that means that's the beginning of the curve. I'd rather have the curves begin at the bottom here. So I'm just going to press F to flip the curve. And now all the circles are at the bottom. That means they're beginning at the bottom there. So it's just like flipping a polygon face. We're just pressing F to flip. Okay, so this this curve right here, the curve stalk core, doesn't need to be adjusted. But this curve, these curves right here, need to be separated. So I'll right click and choose unmerge mesh to separate them. And now we have, it looks like 12 or 13 of those. So no, 12. So I'll just drag them there. Now we're going to quickly rename these so that they kind of have more logical names. Okay, so that was a little bit of a naming nightmare, but I just named everything so that everything, all of the profile geometry matches up with the curve geometry. So in the next step, I'm going to actually uh, extrude this geometry along each of these curves so that we have cylinders or tubes that extrude along here. Alright, so to start with, I'll just select the Stalk Geo core, and then I'll come over to the Mesh Operations tab, and I'll add an operator, and I'll choose Curve, Extrude. Double click that. It'll ask me for a path. I'm going to choose my Curve Stalk core. So CRV Stalk core. Here we go. Okay. Now I'm going to change the selection type to polygon, and then I'll click Invert Polygons. And straight away I can see a problem. This is no longer tapering, so we might have to somehow get this to taper after the fact. But let me just go down the line and we'll start selecting each of these pieces of geometry and extruding them along their corresponding curve. So I'll add an operator, curve extrude. It's going to ask me for a path. I'll choose curve stalk 1, CRV underscore stalk 1, click OK. This is selection type edge. I got to change that to polygon, invert the polygons, and so these are following the curve, which was tapering. So this tube is not tapering. So we're going to have to address that after the fact. So I'll just move along for now. I'll select this polygon and add operator, curve extrude. Path will be CRV stalk 2, click OK. Change selection type from edge to polygon, invert the polygons, and then I'll move on to the next one. And we'll do one more and then I'll speed this up. So add operator, curve extrude, we'll select the path, CRV for curve, stalk 3, OK. Change the selection type to polygon, invert the polygons, and you get the idea. Okay, so now all of these are extruded along their corresponding paths, and again, this core geometry is kind of messed up. Everything else is looking okay. These could be a little bit better. I almost wish they were tapering as well, just to become a little bit tighter. So I might look into that in the next part. Okay, so now I'm going to address this tube or this cylinder, which is not tapering. In retrospect, I shouldn't have deleted the vortex effector or the curves because I could have done this procedurally. But I'm happy with the general shape of this, so it's not a huge loss. We'll just work destructively from here on out. So to begin, I'm just going to select all of the procedural mesh items in my item list that have to do with the stalk, and we are going to freeze these. So I'll just right click and choose freeze mesh operations, freeze, and then I'm going to select all of the curve mesh items, and I'm just going to delete them because we no longer need them. Again, if we still had the vortex effector and all of the bend effectors, we could have used this, but we're just going to delete them just to keep things nice and tidy. Now it looks like everything is out of order, but that's not a huge deal because we no longer really need them to be in order. All I really need at this point is the Stalk Geo core, so I'll just make all of the other meshes invisible. And I'll press 3 for polygons mode. I'll select these two polygons, shift up arrow, and I'm going to use the fall off weight tool in the vertex map menu. So I'll click on fall off weight tool, and I'll just left mouse button click and drag so I know where I want my fall off kind of limits to be. I have my shape preset set to ease out. You can change that to ease in. If you want to see your weight fall off, you can click on the vertex map viewport mode. You can also get to that with Control 2 and just choose VMAP. So I think this is good enough. Let me actually just play with the smooth, ease out, ease in. I think ease out is the way to go, like that. Okay, so escape, and now we have, if I go into my lists tab, we have a fall off weight tool right here. So that is what we just created. So I'm just going to use that, and I don't need to see the vertex weight map, so I can just go over to default. I'll press 2 for edges mode. I'll select this edge. Holding shift, I'll right click and I'll choose this edge. L for loop, R for the scale tool, Alt X for local mode, and then with a fall off set to vertex map, I can just scale this in the YX plane, and I'll have to correct that area up there. But if I start to make my other geometry visible, my other stalk geometry, we can see that it's no longer overlapping. So I'll just scale that in a little tiny bit more, like so, and that's looking pretty good. Okay, escape to drop the tool. I can toggle off that weight map, and let me just temporarily take away these stalks just so I can get at the core. I press Shift Tab to get out of Catmull-Clark sub D mode, 2 for edges mode, and let me just delete these polygons. So Shift Tab, that's looking good. Or delete those edges. Okay. So I might do the same thing for each of these stalks. I might just taper the top of them where they meet the tip of the stalk. Alright, so now that the individual stalks are done, let's create some geometry that could be used to kind of chop this tip off. So I'll press 3 for polygons mode. I'm in the stalk geo core mesh item. I'm just going to recycle this mesh item and repurpose it for the subtractive trim item that will be used to lop off this geometry. So shift up arrow to grow the selection, control C, N for new mesh item, control V to paste, R for the scale tool, alt S for selection action center, and then I'll just scale this in the YX plane. And then escape to drop the action center and the selection, and I'll rename this stalk tip trim. And I think what I'll do is double click this and then Shift D to subdivide the polygons in Catmull-Clark mode just to get some more geometry. W for move, Alt S for selection action center, and then I'll just move this in, move this just in Z. And then I really want to get this to be a little bit more concave. So let me turn on a radial fall off, and it's not aligning. So let me align the work plane to this selection. So work plane, align work plane to selection, and then fall off radial. And did that work? It's hard to say. So double click these polygons, turn on a radial fall off, W for move, turn off my selection action center. The radial fall off doesn't seem to want to work, so let me do a cylindrical fall off. And we'll do auto size, W for move, and that will work just as well. So I'm going to move this in the Y. I'll change the shape preset to ease in, and that's good enough to get me started. So escape to drop the cylindrical fall off. I'll reset the work plane. I'll select these polygons, R for scale, Alt S for selection. I just want to shallow this out so it's not as extreme, and then I'll scale it to make it a little bit larger, and I'll scale it in. W for move, and I'll just move this just in the Z, like so, and I might rotate this a little bit, and I think that's going to do it. And then I want to flip these polygons, so F to flip, because I want them to trim this part right here, so I think that should work. Alright, so now let's fuse this to our existing fusion item. So I'll expand our fusion item. All of this stalk geometry is going to be a primary or an additive kind of element, except for that stalk trim. So I'll pull all of these into the pumpkin folder, and then I'll just move the stalk trim underneath here, And let's see. Okay, so I'll make the fusion item visible. And this is way too big. This is actually a really funny stalk. It's just too big. So let me select all of these items in items mode or polygons mode, Alt S for selection action center. Let me try to scale these as it is. Okay, so that's working fine. So W for move, I'll just move these into place. So that's looking pretty good. I can actually move that a little bit further in Z forward, or Z forward. And that's looking good to me. I might even tip that forward a little bit, just to make it a little bit less even. So E, I'll just rotate that. W for move, move that in. And let me actually see if any of that is poking through. And it's not, so that might be a good sign. That might actually be good for us. And I'm liking this, it's looking pretty funny. Okay, so let me just save, Control S. And let's try to add these to the pumpkin. So I'll make my pumpkin ribs visible. And let's just first take the core and drag that onto one of the ribs and choose Add Apply Primary. And it appears that the wireframe is now white, which means it's no longer, our fusion item is no longer airtight. There's a hole somewhere. So instead of adjusting this and trying to find out where it's not airtight, let me just continue to select these items and drag them onto the primaries. Okay, so it went, the wireframe went white for a while, but then it came back, and now everything is fine. So Control F to toggle the source visibility, Control 1 to bring up my main pie menu, and I'll toggle the grid. I just want to have a look at this from the inside to make sure there's nothing kind of poking through from the top. And this would actually be a good method for making like the inside of a hot air balloon, or maybe the inside of a tent, these ribs. Okay, so what else can we do? I have to set this as a trim. So I'm going to select this trim geometry as well as our Stalk Geo Core. So I'll select both of those, or actually I can just drag this onto, where is our Stalk trim? I'll drag this onto the Geo Core and I'll apply subtraction. Okay, so the wireframe went white, but I'm not going to panic. I'm just going to make these other Stalk parts visible, and then I'm going to start dragging this onto the Stalk parts. Okay, so it's kind of amazing if you noticed, the wireframe again went white for a little while, meaning that we had a hole, and then as I kind of kept fusing, kept trimming this piece from the stalk, we kind of regained the airtight aspect of our mesh. So everything worked out in the end, and I think that's important to note when it comes to fusion, is that oftentimes I think a lot of people panic when they see the white wireframe, or they don't know why they have a hole in their mesh. And you know, this is going to sound like strange advice, but sometimes it's just best to power through it and kind of brute force your way, because it does have a tendency, especially the later releases of Mesh Fusion. The latest release is so robust that it just works. You just have to kind of stick with it. All right, so before I start adjusting the strips for the stalk, I actually want to delete all of the strips. So I'm going to expand the Fusion child items, and where it says strips in this strips folder, I'm just going to click the X next to it, and it will ask me if I'm sure I want to do that, and I'll say yes. So now that the strips are gone, what I want to do is actually come into this area, which I know is a problem zone. So I'm just going to come onto the inside here, and I see that we have these voids here, and this is created by the Stalk Geo Core, which is this cylindrical mesh, and the gap between it and the surrounding twisting stalk geometry. So I'm just going to address that, and I might address this little piece down here and this void that we have here. Now this void isn't the worst thing I've ever seen. I can actually just try and address that right now. So I'll select the stalk geo, I'll select these polygons, shift up arrow to select the surrounding polygons, W for the move tool, and I can just drag this down, and there's still going to be a little bit of a gap, and I can just drag that down a little bit more, or I can just shift down arrow to shrink the selection and just pull that down. And now that void is gone, and we're still getting a nice clean inner part there. If I want to be safe, I can just scale this in the ZX plane just a little bit, and everything is still good, so that's nice. Okay, now one for vertex mode. Let's address these little parts here with the void. So I can press 2 for edges mode. I can select this edge, W for the move tool, Alt S for selection, action center, and I can just move that a little bit. It seems to have broken the mesh. I can pull that back a little bit. 2 for edges mode, I can select this edge right here. It might seem a little bit strange what I'm doing, but this should make a little tiny bit of a difference. Okay, and I got rid of that void, and the mesh is once again airtight. So let me come in here and work on this area. So I'll select this edge and maybe the surrounding edges. W for move, and I'll just move this out a little bit. Now I don't want to penetrate the outer edge, but I think I have enough room to where it's not going to be much of an issue. I just have to make sure that I'm actually making a difference here. So move that out a little bit more in the Y, and then a little bit more in the Z. Actually, that took care of the top half of it. There's just this one little part right here, so I'll just move that in the Z, in the Y, and I'll just move it a little bit more. It looks like we're losing our handles, so just move that a little bit more, and that looks like it has done the trick. So now everything seems good. Let me just zoom out and check. I know this must look really strange looking at it from like kind of the inside of the fusion item, but that little extra work makes a little bit of a difference. Okay, that's worth covering. So now let's update the strip items. So Control F to bring up the Fusion Pie menu, and I'll create update strip items. Alright, so that took a few seconds. I'll just press Control F to bring up the Fusion Pie menu and select all strips. So now all of the strip items are selected. If I want my Fusion strips pop over, I can just hold Shift and click on any of the strips, and doing so will bring up the Fusion strips pop over. I can come over here to strip width, and I can change this to 8 millimeters for all of these, and that actually makes our mesh non-airtight. So let me actually make that 6 millimeters. Let's see what happens there. Okay, so 6 millimeters works for everything. Now, if I really wanted to, I can come over here and make some of these strips 8 millimeters, some of them 12, but just for the sake of this, I'm just going to keep everything uniform. I might take the strip profile and make that 25%. See what happens. That just makes it a little bit kind of like a little bit more of a flat edge, kind of like a flat bevel. I might want to increase the fusion subdivs around the eyes and mouth. That might bother me. And then I'll come over to the strip corners, adjust the density to 5%, and let me change this to this second from the right square, just to get a little tiny bit of rounding. Okay. So yeah, now I think I'm going to come over to the eyes and mouth, which are part of the sweep group, and it's this profile sweep here. I'll just come down to the mesh properties and change the fusion subdivs to 3. And now the mouth has slightly more resolution there. I'll do the same thing for the eyes. So I'll come over to the second sweep group and take that profile sweep mesh, fusion subdivs, I'll set that to 3. And we should see some more geometry or more resolution in the eyes. That looks good. Okay, so back to the fusion item. Let's actually output this thing. So we have airtight final with parts. I'll click dupe and convert to mesh. And I'll name this FO underscore pumpkin underscore, now we'll just leave it at FO pumpkin. FO is for fusion output. I'll create that mesh. And okay, now we have a fusion output mesh. It comes in and it's highlighted white. I'll just right click on it and edit the color and choose none. And then I'll pull that beneath the fusion item. And I'll actually pull that out of the group because I don't want it to be part of the fusion working group. And I'll just close that. Okay, Control S to save our work. And I'll close the fusion strips menu. Alright, so as far as modeling is concerned, we're in the home stretch. So let's clean this fusion output up. So I'll select the fusion output in polygons mode, and I'll come down to lists, and I'll check out my other maps. We have a normal map. I'll just right click. You can either delete or clear this. I'm just going to clear it. And then the next step of cleaning this up is we'll make sure that it's airtight. So I'm in polygons mode. I'll hold Control and click on the edges button, which checks for any boundary edges. That lets us know if this is indeed airtight. And since we have all edges selected, that means we don't have any holes. So this is airtight. So now I'll just run a mesh cleanup. So I'll press 3 for polygons mode, middle mouse button click, and drag a lasso around our mesh. Technically you don't have to do this. You can just leave everything unselected, because when things are unselected in Modo, or when nothing is selected in Modo, everything is selected. So I'll click on mesh cleanup, and you'll notice I only have fixed face normal vectors enabled. That's all I really care about here, so I'll click OK. 24,465 face normals were fixed. I'll click OK. I'm just going to run the mesh cleanup one more time, just because sometimes the first pass doesn't get everything, and we have 4 face normals that are fixed. So just to be safe, I can run that one more time, just because you never know. And no elements to clean, so that means this is completely, this is perfect. So now let's add some materials before we call this finished. So I'll come over to the statistics section, and I'll expand the polygons statistics. And what's nice about the fusion output and the fusion items that we used, if I come over to the actual fusion item and come over to the properties, you'll remember our mesh mode was airtight final with parts. So what with parts means is that if I come over to the lists tab and click on our actual output geometry, we have parts that we can actually use as kind of a way to select the various fusion, or the various parts of the mesh based on our fusion sources. So I'm just going to click the little plus to select the fusion profile sweep, which is the eye. I'll click the plus for the other eye, and the sweep for the mouth. And then I'll skip these strips for now because we don't want all of the strips here. So I'll just click the minus button to deselect that part. And then I'll just start selecting the plus for all of the other inner rib pieces as well as the outer rib pieces. So these are all going to be the orange part. So we have one more or two more. Okay, so M and pumpkin outer mat, and this is a nice orange color. And now that I actually think about it, I might actually want a different color for the inner. So let me select those inner rib pieces. So where's that inner core? Okay, so there's the top inner core. Here's the bottom inner core. And let me select the inner pieces. I should have done this to begin with, but no big deal. There we go. Okay, so M for material. I'll call this pumpkin inside. And we'll just make this a little bit darker. There we go. So now let me actually select the strips, and I'm actually going to try to manually kind of deselect parts of this. So this isn't going to be completely clean, but we'll get the job done. Okay, so I just selected all of the strips between the stalk. It took a little bit, but it's no big deal. M for new material, and I'll name this stalk underscore strips, and I'll make this a very dark green. And that looks good. Okay, click OK. So there we have that. So now I can select the stalk pieces, and we can give this a material as well. So M, and we'll just call this stalk, and I'll make this a lighter green. All right. So I don't know how I feel about the dark green strips. So I might actually undo that. But let me just address the rest of this. So 4 to go into materials mode. I'll select this material. Alt 3 to convert it to polygons, and then I'm going to press 4 again. Actually, let me select that material, Shift M to select both materials, Alt 3 to select both, and then open square bracket to select the inverse, M for material, and let me actually make all of this the new pumpkin material. So where is that? I will make that pumpkin outer mat, and then we'll just redo the inner part. So let me select the inner pieces. There we go. M, and I'll just call that pumpkin inside. Click OK. Okay, so that's not looking half bad. So now you can just take this and light it, render it, add some nicer materials. The sky's the limit. But this was basically a demonstration on Fusion, and I hope everyone has a happy Halloween, and thanks for watching.